Welcome to Creation to Restoration, the podcast that explores behind the scenes of the biblical timeline. With your hosts, Randall Owens and Andy Patt.
Well, good morning, Andy.
Morning, Randall. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing very, very well. And today is a big day because today is the day on the podcast where we start actually talking about the waters of the flood.
Yes.
We've talked about Noah, and we've talked about the boat and the dimensions and what a boat like that would be good for. But today we're actually gonna read the verse where it actually starts to rain.
Yeah. So you're saying a flood isn't a flood without water?
Water is probably the most necessary element if you're going to have a flood. That's just my opinion now. That may not be science.
Well, I mean, but we let the word speak for itself. So let's see what that says then, eh?
Yeah. So we got to jump over to Genesis chapter 7. Verses 11 and 12, and here we go. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. And here's the verse that people normally, that's the only one they talk about. It's right here, verse 12. It says, and the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Here's the big question, because the scientist will immediately try to counter the thought of that by saying, well, even if it rains 40 days and 40 nights, that's not enough water to cover the earth, and there's still all kind of problems atmospherically with that much water and the heat that it produces and all the kind of stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
So, but I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to back up a little bit and look at the verse just before that and how it ends when it says, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the windows of heaven were opened.
Right.
So what is that talking about?
Yeah, so that is kind of getting back to, if you were there for our original creation section where we talked about how the earth was put together.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest takeaway from that was that it's very different than it is today. And today we have, 70% of the earth's surface covered in water.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, it would have been it would have been rivers, streams, and a couple of small seas. But you would have had no large water masses. You could walk anywhere on earth. It was created to be habitable. And the Bible says that repeatedly. God created the world to be inhabited.
Right.
And based on the fossil evidence, based on the amount of coal and oil and everything else that we see, we know that the biomass of the earth was exponentially larger than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
All that got wiped out somehow, something. Maybe a flood. I don't know. But
right. Well, let's stop right there for just a second. I want people to be able to really kind of grasp that idea that if God created the earth, and he said, hey, this is good. This is exactly what I wanted. Here's how this is going to function. And then he put man in it and over it and said, this is your thing, and this is where I want you to live. He said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth.
Mm-hmm.
But if he had actually already covered 70% of it with oceans, and then you say, okay, well, that only leaves 30% for man, but not even that.
No.
If you're trying to judge it by today's earth, and then you've got just places that are uninhabitable.
Yeah, or at least extremely inhospitable. Yeah.
You're not going to be able to live in the desert very long. There's places, and so you got to think, oh, wait a minute now. That does raise the question, what was the earth like before the flood? Was it different? Is there a different thing going on? And how is that described and what's going on? And does that help us explain the fountains of the great deep? And again, if you were listening to the podcast back when we were talking about creation, you would start to see that, talking about the waters above the firmament and the waters below the firmament and separating the waters from the waters and all that kind of stuff. But give us just a little brief recap of what the earth would have been originally before the flood, because that'll give us some insight.
Right. So starting with something not unfamiliar to us today. We have a crust that covers the entire earth.
Mm-hmm.
And we think to ourselves, well, no, 70% of it's water. Well, what's under the water?
More earth.
Dirt. Yep, exactly. So the dirt covers the earth, and then there's some water on top.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also still a lot of water below. In fact, they're starting to suspect, based on what they're doing with a lot of the deep penetrating ground technology, is that there's still more water under the crust of the earth than there is on top, even considering our oceans.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of fountains at the deep isn't foreign to modern science. And so the question then is, was more of it than under? And the Bible suggests that the earth was made with most of the water all under the earth, and that there was no rain. There was a mist that went forth and watered the gardens. So the idea of the atmosphere, the water that was above the atmosphere, because it says in Genesis, he separated the waters from the waters, both below and above the firmament being where the birds fly. So there's that aspect. And then day 3 created the ground, and he covered the waters with the ground. And when you look at Proverbs, and it's 8:28, I believe. Where's that one? Yes, 8:28. He says, when he established the clouds above and when he strengthens the fountains of the deep. And it's talking about the wisdom that was with God in the creation, that was pre-existing the earth and being part of his ability to build and create the earth. And so the idea that the fountains of the deep had to be strengthened, they were essentially put in storehouses. The water of the earth was in storehouses, and it was pressurized. It was contained.
Well, that's what we see in Psalm 33:7. It says he gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He puts the deeps in storehouses.
Yep.
Now, this is something that I had never really thought about, and I think I mentioned this again back when we were talking initially about this and when we were discussing creation, but I'd never really thought about groundwater, which is kind of what we're talking about here. And the way we think about it today is different than it would have been then, because there was so much more of it back then.
Yeah.
But the water that's under the ground, the only reason that I even started thinking about it was because my brother-in-law owns a company that drills water wells. A shout out to Pete. and I asked him, and I said, so how much water is under ground? Because I hadn't really thought about it. Because you think, we only drink fresh water, and where does that come from? Well, is it just coming from lakes and rivers and streams? And well, no, it's under the earth. And you can look at a mountain, and I grew up in the mountains of Virginia, and you see, well, there's this little creek, and then you follow it all the way back to its source. It's just kind of bubbling up out of the ground. And so you see there's some pressure there that's it's forcing it up.
Right.
And so when you take that and you magnify that,
Right.
I think you start to see the principle of what we just read when it talks about the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. So all of this, an unbelievable amount of water is under the crust of the earth. Again, we're not talking about oceans, but it's all under the earth. At this point, there's no oceans. It's lakes and streams and maybe some large lakes, but not like we think today.
Right. So he calls them. It talks about there were seas.
Right.
But seas are bodies of water that are still encapsulated in land, as opposed to our continents now are the parts of land that are encapsulated in water.
Right.
So it's an inverse of how it was. Yeah.
So that's kind of how we got to think about it. There's all this water that's under the earth, and then it says that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. How would that work? How does that happen?
Yeah. So again, if you kind of like take the Earth's crust like an orange peel and you laid it out, and if you consider like the parts that are under the oceans, the thickness of the crust there versus like the tallest mountain ranges, the thickness of the crust there's a big disparity that we see today. Now, arguably, it would have been less of a disparity, and there's evidence to that as far as kind of the results of what's about to happen. But there would have been thicker parts and thinner parts. And so the thinner parts, if you think about a balloon that's filled up and pressurized, like with all that water under the crust, there would have been a lot of tension, a lot of pressure. And based on the weight of the ground and the amount of pressure, without getting into the hard numbers of it, but speculation is at least that it would have been well in excess of escape velocity, like if something were to spring a leak. So what that means is like there'd been so much pressure that if a leak sprung, if a crack formed, that water would have shot forth enough to get into space.
Right. We can kind of visualize that, thinking about all the water that's behind a modern day dam.
Right.
And if you thought about a crack starting to form there and the unbelievable amount of pressure that would be forcing that water out. Now,
it just tears the whole thing
right,
apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everything the dam would just kind of burst.
Right.
So you think about the water would burst forth. So the weight of the earth, the crust pushing down on all of this, the fountains of the great deep.
Right.
And so as they burst forth, it's the weight of the earth pushing down on it.
Right. And so what's one of the thinnest parts of the crust today? Well, it's the bottom of the ocean floor.
The bottom of the ocean.
And reasonably, the thinnest part would be the part where the burst would take place, right? And there's a lot of theories that are really good theories that are, really fun to look at as far as what may have been the trigger event to cause the crack in the first place. But when again, zoom out again in modern context, we know the Earth's crust as being fractured. You know, if you grew up like I did, my most memorable project as a kid was the Pangea project when I was like in second grade, and we had to like do this whole thing about how all the continents used to fit together. Well, spoiler alert, they still do. There's just water on covering parts of them. It's all still connected. But point is there's all these cracks and everything's kind of shifting. But that's not a feature. That's a result of what we see happening when this happened. And right down the center, the Atlantic Ocean, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, it's a very thin part of the crust, and just the striations, when you look at the way that it's, that whole area is broken up, it appears to be where the origin point, the genesis point of the fountains of the Great Deep bursting happened. And if the crack formed there, it would have, at ridiculous speeds, hundreds of miles an hour, it would have just spread across the earth. You would have had this seam that just tears open, and you would have had water, escape velocity water, now shooting into space that would have just sent tons of debris and rock. And now you've got a cataclysmic event where from that center point, you're going to have water that's rushing. Byproduct of that, again, talking about escape velocity water and rock. What was over the earth in the original creation?
Water.
A canopy.
Right.
That whole canopy would have been shattered and torn down. And so you're going to have, rain and pressure systems and weather and all this stuff as the earth, the atmosphere starts to expand. And now, so we lose the pressurization of the atmosphere. We've got this water happening, the rock, the tidal waves that are going to go out and just wipe out the earth. And now consequently, you've also just got huge weather systems that are going to just be tearing things apart and ravaging the earth. I mean, we're talking total cataclysm at an unprecedented scale. Something we can't even wrap our heads around fully today still, because we've never experienced anything like it. Like the worst storms that we get with hurricanes and all that, these are just like thousands of years later ripple side effects of that first storm.
Right. And in comparison, those are localized regional storms. Right. And so, and I know that, even among different biblical teachers today, there's a debate over, was the flood global or was it actually, over the whole earth? And that becomes, some people want to talk about that and debate that, kind of over and over. And the challenge I've got with that is that, Scripture talks about that all of the earth, all of the mountains were covered. And that's the, that's the problem right there. It talks about that there were, 15, it's in, Genesis 7, well, you back up to verse 17. It talks about that the flood continued for 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore upon the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And here it is, and verse 19 of Genesis 7 says, "And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep." So if you're going to believe that the Bible means what it says and says what it means, you're going to go with, yes, this wasn't a regional flood. This was a global flood.
Right. Well, and so that should be the default position of Christians. Naturally and unfortunately, you're going to find people who have a skeptical perspective, even though they claim faith,
right,
because of the indoctrination of the schools and these other, false sciences that claim that they know different. Now, that being the case, pragmatically speaking, if God warned Noah 100 years in advance and it was local, why not tell him to move? But more than that, what was the purpose of the flood? He said, "I am going to destroy all flesh with the earth." We talked about last week.
Right.
Destroying the earth was part of the problem. We're not part of the problem. It was part of the objective.
That was the goal.
And so, God wouldn't have been accomplishing his purpose. He wouldn't have been doing a very good job dealing with the Nephilim if all he wanted to do was wipe out a valley of them. Again, they could move. Nothing makes sense in that perspective. But more than that, when you start to get into more of the geological happenings around a flood of that scale, one of the most common features of mountain ranges today, because you're like, oh, they covered Mount Everest 15 cubits. There's not enough water in the earth to do that. It's like, well, was Mount Everest necessarily there? Following the coastlines, in a lot of the trenches, you see big mountain ranges, and the most common kind of mountain is a folded mountain, where it talks about the rock was like pressed together. And a lot of these, you actually see it where like, it looks like the rock used to be soft and malleable and it was like bent. You get some really neat curved structures and whole mountain ranges like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know about you, but not very many rocks I pick up bend easily. So
most of the time, no.
Yeah, so if you think about millions of years and the slow movement of continents pushing these up and crushing them together, you're going to get things that kind of crumble and jut and harsh edges. You're not going to get neatly folded rock formation, especially when, according to their theories, those layers took billions of years to form.
Mm-hmm.
But you have these layers that are all bent together. Now, in a flood, under the mechanics of this big crack and the water's rushing forth, and then it says the water's assuaged, means they sloshed about. You're going to get all of this hydrologic sorting that's going to happen. You're going to get a lot of settling of layers constantly being turned up. Now, take another thing. We're familiar with the tides, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know that as the moon goes around, it basically takes a bubble of water that follows the moon, opposite sides. And so you get this tide that is ultimately only able to go so far because the land gets in the way.
Mm-hmm.
What if the land didn't get in the way?
You
want to talk about sorting and flipping of soil and turbulent waters? You're now going to get a harmonic tide that follows the moon in a tidal wave that just wraps around the earth constantly. Think about the frequency of the tides, and now that's a tidal wave.
Wow.
That's hundreds of feet tall.
That would do some damage.
That
would change the topography of the earth.
It'd rearrange the real estate a little bit. Yeah, I'd say so.
And so when you say, maybe Mount Everest wasn't there, before the flood, and people would think, well, that sounds crazy. Of course. I mean, it's part of the creation, right? It's like, well, maybe not initially.
Well, yeah, because you have thicker parts and thinner parts.
Right.
And then as the thinner parts are the parts that are getting cracked and therefore eroded from the water emerging, you're going to get a lot of dirt and mud. And just naturally, you're going to have the thicker parts catching more of that and building up. And then as the different plates that are starting to move, there's the continental shift that we see happening slowly. Chances are it was happening much more rapidly at that time. Things are literally smashing into each other. These mountains are folding and building up at a rapid pace as this is happening, which is why the rock was still soft enough to be bent, and we get these folded mountain ranges the way we see them. And all of that is piling up until eventually you've got the thinner parts worn so thin that all the water now has a place to go. Psalms talks about this, and it's Psalm 104, I believe. Yeah, it says, talking about God, and he says, who laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be removed forever. And he talks about what God does next. He goes, thou coveredest it with the deep as with a garment. Talks about the waters were covered over the earth like a blanket, like a garment. And it says, the waters stood above the mountains, and at thy rebuke they fled, and at the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. So now it was God's command ultimately that says the waters fled. It says they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys to the place where thou was founded for them. And he talks again about how he set the bounds that they do not pass over to cover the earth again. The idea is, though, that like the valleys are sinking down, the mountains are going up, and the waters are finding their place, and which is exactly what would be happening through this natural process. The thicker parts get thicker, they build up, everything's happening, and then the ocean beds ultimately are so eroded thin that's where it collapses into the old caverns where the waters used to be stored, and then the water pools back up over top of those caverns.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for just a second.
Yeah.
The idea that so we start with the fountains of the great deep, and there's all this groundwater, under the crust, and there's tremendous pressure from the earth pushing down on that, and then the crack, God has it crack, and we see the fountains of the great deep bursting forth with escape velocity going out. Now there's a void under the earth. Now all the water that was under the earth, or a good bit of it, is now going up, and it's above the earth. And as it settles down, there's this void under the earth that gets crushed back down. And so now we see valleys under the oceans, right? It's because the water's gathered back up, and now we see, again, a majority of the earth covered with water at this point.
Yeah, and it talks about people think about the flood lasted 40 days. No, they were in there for a year.
That's right.
No,
That's
the waters increased for 40 days. So the water was only building up more for 40 days. The rain was a consequence. It was not a feature.
Right. So yes, all of the weather patterns that were created from the bursting forth of the fountains of the great deep, again, caused rain and storms and things of that nature. But again, when we get to Genesis 8, starting at verse 2, it says, the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained. So we see, okay, there's an end to the waters bursting forth, and so now it's covered. You know, the earth is covered, and now we start to see all the stuff. Now, you get down to verse 5 of Genesis 8, and it says, "And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen." And the word there, abate, I know that is a little bit of a difference in translation there. What does the King James use?
Well, no. So the King James uses abate in certain places, but more specifically with the beginning of chapter 8 in verse 1. So what it'll say is that, because it says, "God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged," is what it says in the Old English. Now, it didn't take long even for the English language for the meaning of that word to start to change. So you go back to 1600s, that word had a different meaning than it does today. But the closest modern English that we could use to capture the original meaning of that word assuaged is like sloshed about. It literally means like a coming and going. And so if God is going to go ahead and start to cause things to settle, which is basically what that's saying, that's where the mountains are going to start getting pushed up, the valleys are going to start sinking down, and that is going to have this water just turbulently rushing back and forth,
right?
Which
and
is where a lot of the weather
erosion, right? When it talked about the wind as well, when it talked about the water, this as it's assuaged, right? You get wind and you got water movement, and you got all this stuff. So again, thus creating a very different looking earth post flood,
right,
than it was pre flood.
But then by the time you get to verse 3, even in the King James, is where you start to see that at the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. So it started talking about so there was the idea of them really being turbulent and sloshing about, not just receding in the beginning. And then as everything settled, everything started to just settle out and recede. So it was a multi-step process. It wasn't just constantly receding the whole time.
So let's just pick it up there. If Genesis chapter 8, verse 4. So this has all happened, and it stopped raining, and it has the fountains have been closed again, and again the things are starting to settle. Things are starting to look very different than they would have before. And it says again, beginning at verse 4 of chapter 8 in Genesis, it says, "And on the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat." And then again, it talks about, we know that it was a much longer time before they actually came out of the ark. When we put into context the idea of rest, and that the ark came to rest, in the context of an ancient Jewish reader, it brings to mind the Sabbath. Right. That's what you're going to go. And we now know, again, that Jesus is our rest. He is our Sabbath. The other thing that you got to remember is that Noah's name means rest. So we start to see these things of what's happening, and just before the flood came, God told Noah to come into the ark. He didn't say go get in the ark. He said come. The idea being that God is there. Come join me here. I am where salvation exists. This is where you need to be. Knowing the ark represents Jesus, and Jesus, of course, is our only means of salvation. Come and join Jesus, the ark, the means of salvation. There's something very significant that we have to look at when we talk about that the ark coming to rest. We say often that there's no frivolous information in the Bible. There's no extra stuff that we've not really don't really need. God put stuff in there for us to understand, and things that we don't understand to be able to discover, to dig in and to get some knowledge about. And again, I'm going to go back and read Genesis 8:4 again. It says, "And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat." So why in the world would it be important to give us a month and a day of the month to talk about when the ark came to rest? In the Hebrew calendar, it's a very important date. They've always, what's the best way to say this? knowing that the days and the times and the months are so important in the ancient world, and God set all that up from the beginning. The other thing that we have to keep in mind, that it's the part of the story that would blow your mind if you haven't added everything together. And it's the part that there was something else that was very significant that happened on the same day, this 7th month and the 17th day. And if you don't know what that is, I will just tell you, I know you know what it is, Andy. But I want our folks that are listening to the podcast to understand that is the same day that Jesus rose from the dead. Amen. And as Jesus is our rest, this whole thing is foreshadowed how long before Jesus has come to be our rest and provide that rest. He raises from the dead. His resurrection happens on the exact same day, the exact same month that the ark came to rest.
Yeah. And Jesus, from the moment the stars were created, everything was created to forecast and to foretell God's plan of salvation. And so it's not like he's just like, oh, I'm going to go ahead and get myself up on the day that Noah rested. It's like, no, the ark, God engineered the weather, the situations, everything about the ark was designed to be a anniversary celebration in advance of the ultimate Messiah.
That happens so often. When we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament and how they connect, and it not just prophecies, but events, that when we start to connect the dots and say, wait a minute, God had this planned from the beginning. Yes, of course he did. Yeah. That is exactly right. Just because we didn't know it and we didn't understand it didn't mean that God didn't know it and God didn't understand it. He always knows and he always understands, and he's always got his perfect plan being worked out. Oh, yeah. So I think we just got to leave it right there.
Amen to that.
There's no better place to leave it than when Jesus is our rest. Again, resurrected on the same day that the ark came to rest.
Yeah, and it's like, you framed everything perfectly. Jesus, it's the blood of atonement that seals our salvation. It was the pitch, which was this weird word for atonement, that sealed their salvation through the flood as God invited them in.
Yep. And
then you have the new beginning for a new life with a new hope and a new promise in this new world that Noah's just walking out into, taking place on the same day that our new life, our new beginning, our new hope, our new salvation in Jesus Christ is made possible, this resurrection from the dead.
Again, the new covenant in Jesus.
Yeah.
The old world that Noah would have known before the flood is now a different thing that God has said, okay, here's the new thing.
Yeah, it's almost like being raised in newness of life in some way.
Yeah. All right, we could go down that for a long ways, but we're not. We're going to stop right there. Andy, thanks for coming out this morning. I will see you again next week.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Randall.
All right.